Hello and welcome to another edition of TSAM Daily. Today I'm joined by Paul Taylor. Great place to start off, Paul, would be if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself briefly to our audience.
Yep. That was very kind. Yes, my name's Paul Taylor. My background is primarily in change management, project management. I've been working in the industry for a frightening nearly 33 years and worked across a number of areas, primarily in asset management and fund management. In parallel to that, I'm a director of a number of charities, nothing to do with financial services. I've written a number of books, obviously worked closely with TSAM on some of your regulatory stuff. And also I work for the Open University as a lecturer.
Great. Big topic to get us started, kind of with an overarching theme of Brexit. So a nice place for us to maybe jump in would be if you wouldn't mind giving me your opinion on how Brexit has changed the regulatory landscape.
Yeah, of course, yes. An interesting question now. We're sort of like at the time of speaking, almost 3 months after the exit date. So by a little bit of recap is the UK left the EU on the 31st December last year. The overarching trade deal was a reasonably hard deal. With some good points, but some bad points, like any trade deal. But the key point for this chat, I guess, is that financial services wasn't covered. So effectively, the UK was cut off from the EU. So looking how it can change the regulatory landscape is there are some good points and some bad points depending on what side of the English channel you're on. I think from the good point of view, it will allow the UK to make its regulation far more focused and more appropriate to the UK. It should also allow it to make the UK much more competitive. I think this will definitely happen. Remember, one of the mantras of Brexit was take back control. UK laws made for UK people, made by UK politicians. So that's a very key thing. But I think you have to remember why the UK is physically an island. It's not an island in economic and regulatory terms. Yeah, there's a large amount of business that the UK does with the EU. Most of the firms I've worked with have offices or sister and sibling companies in the EU. Large amount of business in the EU, so we can't be completely cut off. And also, you've got to also remember Brexit is a very political situation. Which basically means, is a polite way of saying, a lot of the decisions that are going to be made don't always seem rational and logical. They're very political. And the skeptic in me sometimes can say it's very much for self-interest, maybe not, and also sometimes pandering to the masses and their voters. So I think also when the UK left the EU, it lost all of its permissions. And if you're from the EU point of view, you're thinking you've got a very powerful ex-member of your trade association, for want of a better word, 22 miles across the British Channel, which is very, very strong in financial services. So the EU could use Brexit as some sort of land grab to try and grab as much as business as possible. So therefore, it's going to be a case of walking on eggshells going forward. The main regulatory thing is very much around equivalence, where effectively the UK will deem some functionality or some regulatory in the EU the same level of sort of like oversight and control, and they would give the equivalence and vice versa. But again, it comes back to the point I mentioned about politicalness. Equivalence isn't done at a court of law and a ticket check-in. It's done at a political level, which basically means it can be given and taken away reasonably quickly. And for those who listen on this work on trading desks will understand that, or particularly equity trading desks, will understand that under the share trading obligations, the UK gave the EU equivalence to venues, which means minor change but minimal change to the EU trading platforms, but the EU didn't give the equivalence to the UK, which basically meant a large migration of liquidity for EU lines from UK venues to EU venues. And that's obviously to try and ensure all EU lines are traded in the EU. And there's similar sort of temporary for want of a better word, equivalents in place around CCPs, CSDs, benchmark, data access and stuff like that. So equivalence is at the moment is a bit up in the air. An alternative option is for firms to look at a country by country sort of like obtaining individual permissions. So a UK firm trying to obtain permissions in the Netherlands or in France or Italy or Germany. Again, it's one of these things that sounds fantastic in theory, but you create a massive complex point-to-point relationships, almost a spaghetti of regulations, which the end result means complexity goes up, risk goes up, costs go up, and the people we're here to actually serve, which often get forgotten, is the end investor, actually don't get the best service. So basically, I think regarding the sort of like landscape, it's a little bit unknown at the moment. There is this memo of understanding, or an MOU or MOU, that's supposed to be announced at the end of March, which at the time of talking is about 10, 11 days away. And I'm going to read what it actually said, because I don't want to get it wrong. It says between the EU and the UK on regulatory cooperation by the end of March. I think the original plan was this, or the original hope when this was announced on Christmas Eve, for those who remember, it was some sort of silver bullet that it would solve all our problems. You know, it's going to be a fantastic trade deal based on financial services. But I think that sort of optimism's really thawed over the last 2 months, 2.5 months. And there's all sorts of threats to the UK, to the UK from the EU, that if the UK diverges regulation, the EU won't agree to anything. So it all comes back to this political posturing. And basically, I was at a seminar last week, and somebody said the MOU might actually just be a very, very, very detailed legalese press release, where basically at the very bottom line we'll say we'll all try and play nicely and be best friends, but behind the back having scraps and having sort of like being petty and tit for tat behind the screens. So to go back to your original question, right, how will they change the regulatory landscape? I think in the interim, probably not much at the moment. There are some changes. Overall, there will be a lot of change. But to be honest with you, until at the moment, it's just too hard to tell what's likely to happen. I just think the biggest worry I have is you're going to have duplicate and similar regulations going out there, which firms ultimately have to adhere to. So.
And I suppose trying to push you slightly on that kind of future view, I mean, what initial thoughts do you have around how Brexit will change the regulatory landscape further out into the future?
Yeah, I think long term it's quite hard to say, because the challenge is there's no precedent. You know, the UK is the first, well, I think it's first, apart from Greenland, I think, which was back in the 70s, is the first country to leave the EU. So there's no precedent on anything at all at the moment. So basically, everything's based on assumptions and guesses. But I think it's safe to say, and you can lead me on this, is that under the remit that the UK wants to take back control, there will be divergence between the UK and the EU. I don't think it's going to be massive divergence. I think it's going to be a gradual divergence, and it's going to be one of those things where you look back 2 or 3 years later and think, oh my God, we're completely different. I don't actually know what we've got here, you know. I think the EU will also implement regulations that the UK won't adopt. I just hope it doesn't become for a tit-for-tat type political argument. You know, I'm sure it won't, but you never know. I mean, a prime example would be that under CSDR, the impact is back in November, I think, or even October, the UK Chancellor said the UK will not be adopting CSDR. Which everybody said, well, what a great bit of news. We're not going to be bullied by those Europeans. But basically, when you look at it realistically, most UK firms settle in the EU, so it makes really no difference. Most UK firms are going to have to install it anyway, albeit a bulk of their trades done on the EU CSDs won't settle. So I think I think, as I come back to before, you're going to end up with duplicated regulations, complicated operating models, probably a lot of UK operations moving into the EU or employing EU firms to have feet on the ground to do certain things. The complexity operating model will go up, which associated costs and risks. And my worry has always been impact to the end investors. So a very, very it's a brave new world, Andrew. So
certainly one way to put it.
Yeah.
I suppose moving us on to a equally kind of large topic that's seen a seismic shift in almost every aspect of life will be COVID-19. So looking at the pandemic, what changes have you seen that have been forced kind of onto the regulatory landscape as a consequence of it?
Yeah, I think the challenge of COVID-19, it appeared almost out of anywhere. I mean, I think for those who remember February last year, it was almost something that's happening on the other side of the world. Within 6 weeks, the country was in lockdown, people were being furloughed, and you had some serious bad news about the number of deaths and everything. So basically, I don't think the regulators have had much time to catch up, really. They've almost been just trying to keep going. So I think if you just think about what's the purpose of regulation, and it is almost to protect and benefit people, businesses, environment, and to support economic growth, which is something I stole off the internet. So, but basically means what regulation is. So I think from a financial services point of view, the regulators will have to think is, yeah, and buying around financial services firms, prime reason is to protect the end investor, to make sure firms don't rip off end investors, give them the best service, give them all the best advice. They're going to look at and say, well, how does COVID-19 impact end investors? So a lot of stuff around maybe insurance policies and stuff like that. The other area I think that will be impacted heavily, and it's not directly financial regulation, it's more an employment law. A lot of firms now are, you see the background behind me and the background behind you, we're all working at home at the moment. I think for all the clients I work with, I'm unlikely to return to the office to probably August at the very earliest. That's on the assumption we actually do return to the office. So the whole world is moving into sort of like a mixed office / is working from home type approach. So cut long story short, employment law will have to catch up, and employment regulations will have to catch up with that. Regarding other areas around sort of like general business stuff like that, there's a lot of discussions in the financial services industry around operational resilience, sustainability and stuff like that. BCP, knowing your vendors, knowing your clients, supporting your clients. I think as the world is now moving to a much more spread around the world, at the moment, most firms had a DR site and a BCP site. Some big banks have probably got 20,000 staff working from home. So effectively their business is spread over 20,000 offices, and flats and buildings. So they need to ensure that, they've got the right processes in place, the controls in place around data movements, cyber security, the right equipment around sort of like the infrastructures they can operate. These firms will also need to check that with their vendors, and their vendors' vendors, and their vendors' vendors, to ensure that they've all got the same sort of level of controls. And I think also from financial service regulation, again, this is no insight. This is my personal, just trying to take everything to its logical conclusion. I think that firms will have to will be much more quizzed around operational resilience, BCP, and ensuring it is as robust as they hope it is. And I know a lot of firms, and actually not always asset management firms, but other firms I work with did struggle with remote work, and they just didn't have the infrastructure in place. Most asset management firms, touch wood, did, because obviously the 9/11 issues they had made firms having proper BCP. But I think it's just it's going to be much more moving towards a working from home, everything spread around the different offices around the world, type of how it will change the regulatory landscape.
You touch on working from home there. I mean, are you seeing companies looking to develop specific work from home policies? And I suppose if you were in their shoes, what would you advise them?
Yeah, I think this is going to be in a strange way, an acid test for a lot of companies going forward. A lot of companies say, in fact, I've worked at about 45 firms. I worked it out the other day, and I've never actually worked for a firm that actually said they're a bad employer or anything like that. They all say they're great employers, yes, and including yourselves, obviously. And but I think this is going to be an acid test now as how firms work, because I think COVID-19 has really unearthed a number of issues. I think the first issue is around sort of like mental health and working from home for mental health. I remember many years ago, and I did some academic research. There was a very big telecom firm who pioneered work from home back in the 90s, and it was the insights they found were fascinating. They found, obviously, they got the technology working and had some process problems like you all do. But what they actually found was the biggest downside was mental health. People were on their own. They sort of missed the general chit chats of sort of like getting their chair, turning it around, walking to the coffee machine, going to the local Starbucks and other surprise to get a coffee. That sort of like social interaction. So I think mental illness or mental health is a big issue. I mean, from personal experience and having friends and families as well, people suffer from stress, anxiety, loneliness, feeling unhealthy because their local gym is shut, working all the hours God sends, because at least when you leave the office you can sort of like turn your laptop off. People got their laptops on, they're working all the hours God send, they're working longer hours, they're feeling pressure to work when they're ill, because if you weren't well you didn't go into the office. If you're ill now, you're in the office, you just don't turn the laptop on. And also the other thing that mentioned is, and it came out from a study towards the end of last year, is people are having some physical illness as well. Maybe not having the right chair, having a laptop that are hunched over, maybe not having the right desk at home, working on a laptop on their things. So I think the key thing here is around openness on mental health illness. There is a sort of like it's particularly when I was growing up in financial services, mental illness was never really taken that seriously. I think what you need to do now is be open. Firms need to be very, very good and understand it and react. I think other things is also like people got carers. I mean, children, grandparents, you know, elderly relatives they need to look after. I know, from example, I have people I know very well who are doing the mother is looking after the child in the morning while the dad works, and vice versa in the afternoon, and that's tiring. You know, in the evening suddenly they're both on trying to catch up on their half days they haven't done. So people are literally working, maybe not 14-hour days, but they're working a long periods during that. So I think firms need to be a bit more flexible. Again, a lot of firms say they are flexible, but how many firms actually really are flexible? And also there's a number of pragmatic issues, apart from the fact of paying conditions. If you've got an employment lawyer, people want working hours. You need to ensure your home has relevant insurance, the work from home, especially if you bring in some, you know, something like these trading kits home, it's pretty expensive. Staff, health and safety. Other two areas just to mention quickly. One's around social activities. People don't have Christmas parties. If they did, they were done over Teams and stuff like that. And also, as you mentioned earlier, the lockdowns there have been for a year. There are people now who've been working for firms for over a year who've actually never been in the office and probably never physically met any of their work colleagues. So there's a lot of good, that sort of like policy stuff around sort of mental illness, pragmatic issues, social activities, and being flexible to understand people's challenges, you know.
And I suppose then kind of zooming back out ever so slightly, I mean, what other regulatory challenges can you see COVID-19 causing, either kind of now or a little bit further ahead in the future?
Yeah, no, in no real particular order. I think on the non-financial side, let's quickly do that first. I mean, it's around employment law, mental health, paying conditions, insurance. All that stuff's going to have to tighten up and move up a level, and firms will get that done. It just takes a while. Legal law takes, especially if law comes from the government. I think there's going to be issues around cyber security and data protection. People are working at home will have client data in their building. You know, how it's stored on the laptops is irrelevant. You know, trading patterns, trading records, on that sort of stuff, confidential information. And I will imagine there will be some sort of regulation around tightening up how that's done remotely. Also, I mentioned before operational resilience. I imagine the regulator will say, well, now your office is spread over 20,000 houses. Now you need to ensure that, you know, you've got resilience. You know, what happens if Teams goes down? What happens if, you know, what happens if Zoom goes down? You need to make sure you've got a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. I think there's going to be maybe stuff around, again, slightly non-financial, but more around business buildings. At the moment, obviously, a lot of firms at the moment have shut their buildings, or the landlord won't let them in. I imagine some of the landlords are going to be very strict about, you know, you can't let your staff in until you've proven they've had the jab and stuff like that. Because last thing they want to do is let one person in who then infects the whole building, and they've got to shut the whole building and stuff like that. So I imagine there's going to be some works around sort of like lease agreements are going to have to change. I think there's going to be a number of scenario tests that the regulator is going to start saying to firms, you're going to have to prove to me that if I do go into your office and unplug Teams, that you can continue to operate without any ripple at all. And a lot of firms will probably say, okay, but don't come to us yet, type thing like that. And the other interesting one that came out, and I was reading it in a well-known newspaper yesterday, was around fraud impacts. Is that you're getting a lot of people doing online fraud. I mean, you hear these people ringing up saying, you know, if you give us £20, you can have the jab done earlier, which is complete fraud. You get the £20 and all you do is get nothing. I imagine people are going to start saying, you know, for trying to spoof websites now, trying to spoof everything else. I think fraud's a big thing that's likely to come up as well. Yeah, so to summarize, I think it's going to be employment law, data protection, business resilience, building regulations, customer protection, scenario planning, and fraud, which seems that every disaster somebody tries to take an advantage with a fraud. So
yeah. I mean, you touched on technology there, which I think segues us nicely into looking at the cloud. I mean, what do you feel about compliance technology moving over to the cloud, and what do you see as some of the potential risks of that shift?
Yeah, I think the issue is because I've been around many years, I've seen a large number of these new technology things come and go, and they're always deemed to be some sort of silver bullet. You know, cloud computing, the internet, e-commerce. I remember client server back in the 80s. stuff like that. So I think what it is to understand that while cloud computing has some fantastic benefits, it's not a silver bullet. For every problem it solves, it creates a new problem that needs to be addressed. Therefore, I think when you're using any sort of cloud computing, whether it's for regulatory stuff or anything else, you need to have a clear reason why you're using the cloud. I mean, not because next door are using it. You need a very, very clear reason for it. And therefore, if you're looking to move stuff onto the cloud, regulatory technology, for example, you need to obviously select your vendor with care. And this is not anything to do with cloud. This is standard business vendor business. And also determine what cloud service you're going to get, as infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. They're all good, but they're all different. You need to know what you're buying, really. And then for the general migration plan, you need to mention, are you buying a cloud system, or are you looking to move an existing system onto the cloud? They're two very different things. A cloud system's fine because it's been designed for the cloud. But again, from personal experience, trying to move a system that hasn't been designed for the cloud onto the cloud, A, you have a number of technical problems, inevitably, and B, you might have a number of legal issues, because the vendor might say, well, we're not going to actually say it's able to run on the cloud. Therefore, if you want to move it onto the cloud and it goes wrong, you're completely on your own. So opens up another type of risk. But specific issues compliance is around, I wouldn't say, I think it's a good idea to put it on the cloud. It's easier to deploy and stuff all like that. But you need to also double check things around like security of data and access to data. The idea of the cloud, you put it on the cloud and the cloud vendor spreads it all around the world. So you have great security, so you have great reliability, which is brilliant. But then if you are a certain bank, would you want to put a bank in a certain country, make sure your data is available to another country whose jurisdiction can just literally say, well, we're going to go and take your data and have a look at it. So therefore, you have to be very careful about that. I think also to mention also around is that basically brings in other risks and governance. Governance of data becomes very, very important. And the other area and the final part about cloud computing is when you get these new fads come out, or these new, I say fads, that's a terrible thing. When these new things come out, which are actually quite good, you get a lot of people who jump on the bandwagon who suddenly rename themselves. Previously they were infrastructure consultants, now they're cloud consultants. Previously they were SQL programmers, now they're big data scientists. So I just think you have to be very, very careful about the resources and the expertise. But overall, I think cloud is a good way forward. I just think it's it'll take a while to get into. It's like any new thing; it just takes a while to become mainstream. So,
and then I suppose finally, looking ahead, what do you see as some of the major regulations to start to look out for?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, an immediate thing is obviously, in no particular order, you got CSDR, which is the trying to tighten up this settlement, will basically stop people settling late on trades on the EU, to put it bluntly. I think that's obviously due to go. Well, bits of it gone live already. The first chunk of it's due to go live, settlement discipline, February next year. So at the time of speaking, that's about 10 months away. There's a consultation in place over that at the moment. Whether that will delay the implementation or reshape the scope, impossible to tell, but we shall see. We're in the hands of regulators at the moment. Other areas that are very important, I think, around sort of like general operational resilience and managing your suppliers. All asset managers rely on vendors. If they say they don't, then they're lying. They are, I mean, people outsource TA, they outsource fund accounting, outsource technology. Back to your previous question, clouds use and things like that. I think what a lot of firms are worried, what the regulators are often worried about, is how much control they can have over critical infrastructure. So, for example, if me and you, Andrew, had a firm and we outsourced our transfer agency to a leading provider, of which there's many, that leading provider will then maybe outsource some of their technologies to a leading cloud provider. We also have our data on that leading cloud provider, our internal email system or what have you. Therefore, if that cloud provider fails, our provider fails and we fail. And so we're in the trouble. The financial regulator will look at it and think, we've got no control over that cloud provider. We can't actually go into their front door and say, and we want to do audits of you, we want to check your BCP or all your governance. So I think that's an area that's going to happen around operational resilience. ESG is always popular at the moment. I do remember the first wave of greenness back in the late 80s, early 90s, when everything was going green and sort of disappeared and it's all come back again. I think ESG / or climate change type, all stuff. I know they're all slightly different, they all overlap. I think that's a genuine thing that's likely to happen. And other areas around, I think around sort of like, excuse me, is IBOR eventually will go, LIBOR to be more precise. And the last area, so I think the will move it is really around cultural change and conduct change. I think the financial services were very aware of the alpha male, not trying to be too sexist, attitudes that came out, caused the credit crunch, and they're looking for much more sort of considered behaviours in firms. But otherwise, no doubt a few things have come over the fence on Brexit. But I think if you're working in regulations, I think you've got a long, fruitful career ahead of you.
That's brilliant, and that's a great place for us to end. Paul, all it meant for me is to say huge thank you as always for giving us the time, and look forward to catching up again soon.
Okay, that's great. All the best.